second lecture is entitled Philosophical Anthropology, the Foundation of Certitude in Ethics. So, my first point is the problem of an excessive rationalism. Probably the greatest theological question of the 20th century was that of the relationship between nature and grace. Leading theologians, and in particular de Lubac, noticed that there was something deeply wrong in the neo-scholastic formation that was dominant in the Catholic world before Vatican II. The old seminary manuals generated a conviction that nature is unchangeable, coherent and logical, basically self-explanatory, whereas grace is an added-on gift to those who deserve to be rewarded by God. The Latin manuals of philosophy, through a series of theses justified by logically impeccable syllogisms, presented a comprehensive view of reality, and therefore also of man and his psyche, that was in stark contrast with multiple modern currents of thought that were all shown to be completely erroneous. When the seminarian moved into theology, he was given similar manuals that also offered a list of theses justified by their interior coherence and reference to scripture, tradition, and ecclesial condemnations of contrary heretical positions. It was a standard comment about some of these manuals that you could delete all the biblical references and the exposition would still stand on its rational logic. In this intellectual formation, there was little room for the divine mystery, no serious treating of real questions that were being raised in the world. And worst of all, nature and grace seemed to be structured like a London bus. Nature was the lower deck. As the lower deck, nature was understood to be completely self-sufficient, intrinsically coherent, and therefore supposedly evident, whereas grace as the upper deck was attractive, giving a better view, good for contemplative nuns, but basically optional. A bus with one deck can function just as well, or even better, than a London bus. What was said about man within metaphysically justified philosophical anthropology was presented as absolutely rational. It seemed to be confirmed by society, at least in the Catholic world, and therefore was understood to be obvious. If it was ignored or rejected by some people, this was probably because they were obnoxious. Had they been clear in their thinking, they would surely have been convinced by the metaphysical arguments. When people sin, it was assumed, is either because they are ignorant and they do not know the natural law and its implications, or because they haven't made enough effort, or because they have not prayed enough asking for the support of grace. Grace was not denied. It was understood that it was necessary, in particular for the interior life. But basic moral behavior was treated as the realm of the exterior life that could be sufficiently explained and worked out through rational argumentation. And if there were problems in the social and political world, this was held to be the result of an insufficient reference to the natural law. It was imagined that it is enough that the natural law will be explained to the unbelieving but honest and rational politicians, and then an appropriate social order will ensue. This simplified presentation of the leading features of the old intellectual formation is, of course, a caricature. But great intellectuals in the Church were unsatisfied with this, and so they tried to formulate a new theological synthesis. Vatican II followed them, and then the popes showed how the Council's teaching is to be received. The renewed magisterium offers now a deeper, more theological view of man, without renouncing the natural law, even though classical philosophy and speculative theology are no longer in fashion. Nature is more clearly seen to be located within the one divine project, But its basic reading, also within philosophical anthropology and the natural law, continue to have a place within Catholic teaching, even though that place is not as central as it used to be. Is there an objective human nature? Well, as we look around the world today, it seems that it is becoming increasingly difficult to defend the claim that there is an objective human nature underlying natural law ethics. Does nature really inform us about an unchangeable structure of man, now that it is technically possible to produce embryos in vitro, maybe even to clone humans, to change the sex of individuals, to transplant living organs from bodies in which the brain has been declared dead, when some people claim that they have a natural, innate homosexual orientation, when the term marriage is acquiring new meanings, when an increasing number of people opt for living as singles without a stable family around them, and when so many men see no problem in fathering children and then abandoning them and their mothers, when the moral standards that are expected of society are constantly in flux and are politically negotiated, when personal responsibility is being reduced and the social responsibility of states is being increased, and when we have extensive knowledge about people living in cultural settings based upon moral standards that are at variance with what has been treated as normal in Europe, can we still speak of some objective human nature and of a natural law? Are we not waging a lost battle, referring to some theoretical, supposedly intrinsic, fundamental human nature, when people prefer to attribute primacy to their own subjective, ephemeral, and changing experiences, this being the only reality that they observe and to which they can refer? The observation of the fact that ethical standards in societies vary is not new. People living at the borderlines of civilizations always knew this. The Polish historian that I mentioned this morning, answering a question, Felix Koneczny, who worked in the first half of the 20th century, devised a theory of civilization based upon descriptive ethics. He noticed that civilizations have specific views about what is morally appropriate, even if at times people do not live up to the standards they uphold. Distinctive perceptions about what is morally due persist for centuries, thus they can be observed by a historian. Whenever peoples of differing civilizations met, they always had to work out the encounter, assuring at times that those who have different value systems functioned only within their own enclaves. But when there were attempts to forcibly mix civilizations, this always led to confusion, to the decline of general moral standards, and ultimately to violent clashes. It is easier to adapt to people of a different race, level of education, wealth, or social class than to people who hold differing ethical standards. A monogamist will never sell his daughter to a polygamist. Those whose social life is based upon personalism do not want to live as slaves of an omnipotent state, bureaucracy, or police. The transfer to a civilization having a less demanding social ethos entails moral degeneration. The maintenance and expansion of a higher social ethos requires effort and perseverance. All this proves that the automatic, intuitive perception of what is morally appropriate in private and public life is culturally conditioned. Those in India who instinctively accept the caste system, irrespective of whether they belong to the higher or lower caste, have no sense of guilt about this. This seems to them to be normal, that is, natural. In spite of all this, the Church still insists upon referring to a binding natural law, claiming that apart from faith, we can rationally know the objective truth about human nature. The distinction between nature and grace, and therefore between reason and faith, has not been abolished. Moreover, faith sharpens the mind, inviting it not to stop short on the level of observation of phenomena, and urges it to go forward in philosophical reflection towards an understanding of essences and finalities that the empirical sciences cannot observe. The nihilist, skeptic, postmodern mind thinks that such a trust in the power of reason is exaggerated. The liquid society experiences and seems to approve changing moral standards. These contradictions therefore need an explanation, and one that is rational, not based upon faith. Since in St. John Paul II's encyclical Fides et Ratio we have a defense of the dignity and capacity of the philosophical mind, I shall leave aside the epistemological question and focus only on the common discrepancy between the objective insights drawn from the natural law and the subjective perception of different moral values that are sometimes experienced as natural. Rational psychology of moral agency offers some clues that can help explain these contradictions and even suggest some practical corrective solutions. So we'll look at a Thomistic explanation of existing contradictions. First of all, it has to be stressed that the natural law is formulated through reference to the intrinsic finalities of the components of human nature. Natural law is not a deduction drawn out from some mythical pure nature that had existed only before original sin, nor is it known through inductive reasoning based upon historical and sociological studies of cultures, nor is it based upon merely biological data. Aquinas derived his classical exposition of the natural law from the fundamental metaphysical inclinations of human nature. These tend towards the conservation of being, towards procreation and the education of offspring, and towards cognition of the ultimate truth about God, and living in society on the basis of that truth. Since human nature has both a corporal and a spiritual dimension, it encompasses also the finality of the spiritual faculties. Thus, that which is the product of the creative mind, if it is in accord with the finality of nature, it is natural, even though it may be artificial. An artificial limb that replaces an amputated leg does not contradict natural law. Since the natural law is deduced from the essential structure of the human being, it assumes that human nature does not change over the centuries, even though customs do, and that there is an objective moral order which can, even though with difficulty, be rationally known. But even Aquinas knew that natura hominis est mutabilis. Human nature is changeable. He recognized that in practice some changes do come about in the functioning of nature. These, he said, derive from bodily changes that influence the soul, and from the free choice of individuals, which sometimes is perverse. That is why, he argued, positive law may deny the natural right of possession of arms to a madman or to an enemy. Even though Aquinas had a limited ethnographic knowledge of societies, he knew the sociological observation made by Julius Caesar, that, salve reverencia, the Germans lived according to a specific social ethos and didn't see anything wrong in robbery. Aquinas saw in this, these were of course the ancient barbarian Germans, Aquinas saw in this a consequence of the depravation of reason coming from the passions, bad customs and habits. Thus for him it was a deficiency in the knowing of the natural law, and not a proof of its inexistence. The perception of truth is both theoretical and practical. It is the same reason that sometimes functions in the speculative mode and sometimes in the practical. Practical cognition is immediate, focused on a contingent act that is about to take place. This cognition is influenced by the specific personal and physiological characteristics of the agent, because it is supported by the inclination of the emotions and the sensitive cognition. The practical judgment of a moral act, being instinctive, does not have the time for theoretical syllogisms. It may be in accord with the objective verum bonum, the true good, that can be known by a speculative reason in its calm and attentive reflection, or it may be in disaccord with it due to the presence of certain psychic mechanisms coming from habituation or from a depraved cultural environment. In the perception of the practical truth, the practical reason is influenced by the sensitive usefulness judgment. This is one of the internal sensitive cognitive powers, besides memory, imagination, and the sensus communis that gathers together the impressions of the external senses. These cognitive powers trigger emotional reactions. The sensitive usefulness judgment is called the vis estimativa when it appears in animals. It instinctively suggests what is useful as food or building material for a nest and what represents a danger. Since in humans this judgment is marked by rational knowledge, it is called the vis cogitativa. It seems to coincide with the practical reason as it issues a judgment about action, and hence the terminological concurrence, but in fact the two are not identical, because the vis cogitativa is sensitive, having its specific physiological location in the brain. It functions, however, as if it were a spiritual faculty of the mind, because instinctively it collates justifications, and together with memory, that is the power of experience, it grasps the meaning of a sensitively ascertained object, suggesting a connatural, practical truth about the coming action and emotional reaction. Contemporary neurological studies of the brain have localized the organ through which the moral decisions are made. It is known that its wounding impairs the capacity for practical moral reasoning. Although even Aquinas knew that if somebody was hit on the head with a sword and survived, he had difficulties in moral reasoning. The brain has a great plasticity, and as a result of past actions, personal decisions, and external factors, neuronal connections are made within the brain, engaging its various parts. These connections are in constant flux. They condition the sensitive reaction that instinctively judges the eventual usefulness of a perceived object. The brain is not to be identified with the mind, even though it is its necessary foundation. Neuroscience can only tell us that the brain enables moral reasoning. It doesn't tell us why a person gives a particular reason to justify an action. The brain is embodied in the skull, but it is also embedded in the person, who is subject to various external influences, suggestions, and rational arguments, some of which are in accord with human nature and its intrinsic finality, and others are not. These external, psychic, and also environmental, social factors contribute in a dynamic way to the generation and transformation of neural connections within the brain, which then condition the functioning of the sensitive usefulness judgment. In practice, therefore, the cognition of the sensitive usefulness judgment is collated with the judgment of practical reason. Their functioning in a healthy individual is such that the instinctive recognition of the practical truth and its cognition by the practical reason are basically the same. The pianist, who is moved by his artistic sense, hits the keys immediately with no preceding rational reflection. Speaking in a known foreign language, one immediately finds the appropriate word. The ping-pong player reacts to the approaching ball faster than he can assess its velocity and think about the reaction. Similarly, in virtuous action, the appropriate behavior is found directly, as it expresses the integration of the reason and the will with the emotion in the grasping of the good. In technical and moral proficiency, these reactions, the meaning of which can be theoretically pondered upon, become automatic, precisely because the sensitive, that is, the physiological judgment of the usefulness of the object, and the practical recognition of the truth about it by reason, combine. With this Thomistic explanation, we can say that a sort of habitus is formed in the sensitive vis cogitativa that inclines towards the specific contents of the automatic sense cognition. It has to be called a quasi-habitus and not a normal one, because this instinctive judgment is more the fruit of neural connections in the brain than of conscious choice. It functions immediately, but the fact that the instinctive judgment is specifically such is a consequence of internal bodily dispositions, previous conscious actions, accustoming, and also external environmental and cultural influences. Thus, many of these contributing factors are conscious. It is no surprise, therefore, that some people have developed a greater facility in a given virtue than others, just as some people have technical and artistic capacities which others do not have. This is because their temperament and their personal histories are different. The inclination that springs from the quasi-habitus in the sensitive vis cogitativa is experienced as being connatural, but it does not necessarily incline to that which is objectively in accord with human nature. Thus, it is not surprising that there are people who protest against appeals to an immutable natural law because they say their subjective nature is different. And there is a kernel of truth in this reaction, because the spontaneous sensitive judgment of the vis cogitativa, which has a physiological backing, being subject to habituation, may have acquired an inclination towards that which is not in accord with objective human nature. This fact explains the possibility of training animals. Their vis estimativa may be manipulated by humans. An animal that appears in a circus does not react as its animal nature dictates, but in accord with the training that it has received from the human. Also, in humans, the sensitive vis cogitativa may be geared in various ways, and so it may incline to objects that are contrary to the basic finality of human nature and its components. This observation is by no means recent. Aquinas knew about this, and he gives examples of distortions in the instinctive judgment of what is pleasurable. Sometimes a sick person has the impression that that which is sweet is sour. There are people who, due to a particular alteration of their physiological disposition, find pleasure in eating the soil or coal. There are those who find a connatural pleasure in homosexual acts, sexual encounters with animals, or in cannibalism. These are all examples given by Aquinas. It is known today that pedophiles often have been victims of this abuse, and this probably is the origin of their perverse urge. So liberation from inclinations that are contrary to the true finality of human nature is not easy when the quasi-habitus of the usefulness judgment, rooted in the brain, has been formed in a distorted manner. Such perverse inclinations should not be regarded as natural, even though they may be connatural. Since they contradict the natural finality of the human faculties and their objects, they do not lead to deep satisfaction and internal peace. Instead, they generate anxiety, even if the environment may approve them. Disturbances generated by this unease often lead to an obsessive search for gratification and for some other means that are to alleviate the pain. Thus addictions are born. When the practical reason and the vis cogitativa are in accord with the objective nature, an authentic connaturality springing from interior coherence is elicited, and it generates happiness. Nature supports the tendency towards the true good, whereas disorder in nature disintegrates the person and leads to anxiety. This philosophical assertion assumes that beings are endowed with finality. Fundamental tendencies towards appropriate ends are metaphysical and not psychological, but conformity with basic finalities elicits psychological reactions. The choice of moral acts, therefore, has to take into account the deepest finalities of the will and of the other faculties of the body and soul that incline towards their appropriate objects. All faculties and their objects have an inherent meaning. The appropriate ends of the human composite are not a matter of free choice, because they are determined by nature. Nature is given, whereas the means leading to the ends are chosen through the liberty of specification and of exercise. What is decisive, therefore, is whether the inherent finality of the object of choice is instinctively perceived or not, because it is this finality that is the ultimate measure of truth, of the practical reason, and it attributes rectitude to the affective faculties engaged in choice. The grasping of the practical truth that is in accord with the finalities of nature is instinctive. Thus, whenever the object of the practical reason is recognized in truth, it generates a resonance in the affectivity, and this sustains moral virtue. Virtue then does not require any extraordinary effort. It comes about easily. But when the sensitive vis cogitativa has been deeply distorted, the object of practical cognition that is grasped instinctively is untrue. In this situation, even a correct but merely theoretical knowledge of the good will not necessarily generate virtue. And when the theoretical exposition of that truth will be insisted upon together with an imperative sense of obligation, this may generate a neurotic attempt to comply with it, based upon sheer willpower or rather emotional effort, but this will not be truly virtuous and liberating, and in time it may lead to a Freudian revolt against all moral values. The moral truth that can be explained theoretically has to be recognized within the practical cognition and the automatic sensitive judgment before virtue can be born. Often more than a theoretical explanation of moral values, what is needed is the undoing of a perverse quasi-habitus that has been formed in the vis cogitativa. True connaturality that is in accord with nature sometimes has to struggle against an acquired, rooted, and unnatural inclination that is experienced as being connatural. It is only when distorted interior psychic mechanisms have been reworked in accord with the inherent finality of nature that the true connatural reaction contributing to virtue will appear. The changeability of brain structures, conscious opposition to demoralizing environmental influences, and a religious conversion facilitate in this process, but of course it is known that the plasticity of the brain declines with age, and so liberation from deeply rooted disorders becomes more difficult with time. Nevertheless, we have to believe that the true living out of faith that humbly invites the grace of Christ into the very nitty-gritty of moral agency and frees from Pelagian attempts at self-correction does have a healing effect. We know obviously that humanity does not always live in accord with its created nature and the divine project revealed in the glorified humanity of Jesus. There are many acquired, ingrown, and seemingly natural resistances to moral truth. What more, we know that the great ideologies that had rocked modern history have all proposed the formation of some invented new man in accord with their historical, socio-political, and cultural projects to which they attributed primacy, whilst they ridiculed the metaphysically grounded anthropology. This is also true today, even though the contemporary ideologies prefer to impose their agenda in a soft rather than in a direct, brutal way. The Thomistic perception of the role of the sensitive vis cogitativa, and of the fact that a perverse quasi-habitus is sometimes developed in it, can serve as an explanatory key in the studying of various conflicting and novel propositions for the being and moral behavior of humans that to some appear to be natural, whereas in fact they have only a subjective, connatural basis. This explanation pinpoints the precise psychic locus that needs to be exercised through corrective guidance and grace. The purifying power of the Holy Spirit needs to be introduced not only into the mind, but also into the body, which is the Spirit's temple, and so also into the sensitive, physiological, cognitive faculty. It is worth remembering here that divine influence can go so far, and that it is not an imposing manipulation, but an eliciting of that to which the body and the soul are naturally geared anyway. In the light of these Thomistic observations and speculative distinctions, I shall now reiterate and interpret several fundamental assertions about human nature that we know are at variance with many contemporary vociferous views, which to some appear to be natural, even though they do not correspond with the inherent finalities of human nature. So a few basic truths about man. First of all, human beings have a given sexual identity that is male or female. This is set already in the zygotic stage. The basic roles of men and women do change, but customs cannot alter the basic data of nature. There are, however, as we know, some individuals who have an unclear sexual identity, with characteristics of the opposite sex appearing in their psyche and even body. The exact causes of this are unknown. Maybe it is a result of the hormonal poisoning or some other factors. Such individuals need to be pitied and helped. There is nothing wrong in strengthening the dominant sex, but the body should not be manipulated so as to make it fit the suggestions of the mind. You do not shorten the legs of somebody my size who claims to be Napoleon. So the fact that there are people with a flawed sexual identity doesn't justify the general thesis that there is no such thing as sexual identity. Our sexual identity is a part of our being, and it conditions our personhood. The gender ideology denies the existence of a permanent sexual identity. It treats sexual differentiation as a superficial and optional phenomenon, meaning that liberty can ignore the body. This is a form of philosophical idealism that denigrates the body and isolates sexuality within it, treating it as a product of the mind, of the caprice, or changing cultural influences. The rearing of children in such a way that they will have the freedom to choose which sexual identity they will want deforms them in the name of a sick ideology. All treating of the body as something secondary in respect to the person and as a means for play and fleeting pleasure demonstrates a lack of respect for the body. It also warps the mutual respect between men and women, which is based upon appreciation of the sexual difference. Next, the homosexual tendency is a psychic alteration. It is contra naturam, against nature, even though some individuals experience same-sex sexual attraction as connatural. It appears in those whose emotional development has been disordered by internal and more often external factors. The homosexual tendency is closed or indifferent towards the basic truth about sexuality, which serves procreation, and so it focuses primarily on pleasure derived from sexual contacts with individuals of the same sex. There are various levels of this homosexual tendency. the natural responsiveness to emotional contact with individuals of the same sex acquires in this tendency a sexual dimension of varying force. It may involve emotional dependency upon the other, the desire to elicit sexual reactions in the other, narcissism, concentration upon self, homosexual erotic fantasies, and finally direct genital contacts. Growth in emotional maturity is not facilitated by environmental suggestions that normal emotional contacts within the family and among adolescent friends are probably homosexual. Same-sex fascination may appear temporarily in closed environments, particularly amongst the emotionally fragile, but this is not necessarily a permanent quality of the individual. Where, however, there were abusive but pleasurable sexual contacts long before the thought of setting up a family had appeared, a perverse sexual tendency may be fixed in the psyche, focusing only on pleasure and not on confrontation with the otherness of the opposite sex and on procreation. There is no such thing as a sexual orientation. This term, introduced by gay lobbies, is misleading. It presumes a permanent constitutional quality of the individual who is supposedly either homosexual or heterosexual, with sexuality being intrinsically indifferent as to its object. It suggests that sexual orientation is the essential ontological quality of an individual. This is erroneous. The sexual male or female identity is an essential quality of the individual, and homosexual attraction is only an accidental, degenerate tendency of an individual's sexuality. Thus, the term homosexual is also inappropriate, suggesting that the finality of sexuality, thus the term heterosexual is also inappropriate, suggesting that the finality of sexuality is optional and changeable. The documents of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith consciously avoid the noun homosexual and speak about the homosexual person. Each person has multiple tendencies, talents, and capacities, and the reduction and identification of the individual through a sexual tendency is always an impoverishment. The person is not to be defined through a distortion of the sexual tendency, which is not a distinct anthropological category. Individuals having a homosexual tendency need to be respected for the various values that they may have, and reminded that their body is still endowed with the natural capacity for procreation through a sexual relationship with a person of the opposite sex. The sexual orientation cannot define a person, because there is more in the person than the sexual urge. There is no person without a body, and so the sexual male or female identity functions through the body, but it is not exhausted by it, since it expresses the entire person. Sexuality is not restricted to the body and its movements. It also influences spiritual activities, creativity, talents, virtues, and vocations. The isolation of bodily sexual experiences and their elevation to the status of a basic qualification of the person, and this is what the term sexual orientation suggests, simultaneously reduces everything else that is important for the individual. Work, knowledge, generosity, love, and social bonds, they are reduced to a secondary rank. Thus, marriage appears to be only one of the many life options, and it is treated on an equal par as being single or in the homosexual partnerships. This new anthropology lies behind the forced insistence on the changing of the meaning of the word marriage. The terms gay and lesbian have a precise meaning. They refer not to a person experiencing a homosexual tendency, but to a person that speaks about this publicly and demands to be accepted as such, even having a special legal status. The gay or lesbian may experience only a superficial and passing homosexual tendency, but that tendency is intellectually affirmed and made public. According to rational psychology, the homosexual tendency is located within the vis cogitativa, and it influences instinctively the practical reason, suggesting homosexual actions and reactions. Whereas with the affirmation of a gay or lesbian identity, the theoretical reason has accepted the homosexual orientation as a central characteristic of the individual and as a universal value. Not only the affectivity of the gay is deformed, but also the speculative mind. Thus the gay will never say that his condition is unnatural. If it generates some psychic discomfort, he is inclined to blame others for this, accusing them of phobias. Somehow he fails to understand that those who do not accept the gay ideology are not necessarily driven by fears, but maybe by fearless convictions. A negative moral assessment of homosexuality does not necessarily entail a denial of human dignity and lack of concern for the afflicted person. Marriage has its foundation in human nature. It is not a cultural invention, like a trade or social contract. Individuals are free to marry or not with this person or another, but the nature of marriage does not depend upon their liberty, arbitrary ideas, or the decision of the church or the state. Even Karl Marx knew this. Marriage is an objective reality grounded in human nature, and the sacramental gift elevates marriage, supplying grace that enables the couple to live in fidelity and charity. But marriage itself is natural, as the basis of the social unit that is the family. Even where people live in polygamous clans, marriage is a part of their social unit, and it entails fidelity, procreation, and responsibility. Whenever marriage is reduced to a simple arrangement that can be repealed with greater ease than a trading contract, grave personal and social consequences ensue. God always pardons when asked. People sometimes, but nature never forgives him. As the Church reflects upon this, it's good to remember that St. John the Baptist gave his head in the defense of the indissolubility of a natural, pagan, non-sacramental marriage. The root cause of desocialization. The desocialization that we're observing now, the increasing number of crashed marriages, people living alone, a reduced social cohesion, and an increasing dependency on welfare, all this is a new social phenomenon that is perplexing. We need to seriously address the question raised by the Beatles, by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. They said, all the lonely people, where did they all come from? Searching an answer to this question posed by the Beatles, I propose the rereading of paragraphs 11 and 12 of Blessed Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae. In that text we read, it is necessary that each conjugal act remain ordained in itself to the procreating of human life. This doctrine is based on the inseparable connection established by God, which man on his own initiative may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, both of which are inherent to the marriage act. Due to the intrinsic nature of this connection, intimam suam rationem, the conjugal act which unites husband and wife in the closest of bonds, renders them also apt to bring forth new life according to laws written into the natures of males and females. And if both of these essential qualities, the unitive and the procreative, are preserved, the use of marriage fully retains its sense of true mutual love and its ordination to the supreme mission of parenthood to which man is called. Now, this is my translation. Most translations, including those on the Vatican website, in the languages that I know that I've checked, I don't know the Chinese and the Arabic, but most translations ignore the comma after the intimam suam rationem in the central sentence, and then they interpret it as referring to the physical union of husband and wife, and not to the nexus, the connection between the unitive and procreative significances of the marital act. This greatly weakens the text and suggests that the mere physiological union of man and woman makes them responsible for children. You of course know that this is not true. And I went to the Latinists in the Secretariat of State, and I said, this translation is wrong. And they said, no, it's correct. Well, reread it. Well, it's correct, but there's an unnecessary comma there. Well, I said, if Paul VI put the comma there, treat it, recognize it. Well, yes, if we recognize the comma, they agreed ultimately with what I said, that the intimam suam rationem refers to the intrinsic nature of the connection between the two significances, which makes the couple apt to receive life. What Paul VI said is that when the procreative significance is not excluded in the experience of sexuality, the husband in his love affirms his wife's capacity to be a mother. He wants to be a father through her, because he has esteem for her human qualities that he wishes for their children. The wife, on her part, affirms her husband's potential paternity. She wants him to be the father of their children. She also wants to help him grow in paternal virtues, in generous responsibility, in concern for the family, in his capacity to educate their future children. The husband learns paternity through his wife. In this way, the spouses mutually help one another in the overcoming of egoism and spiritual growth, and in their openness to divine charity. When the contraceptive mentality enters the marital relationship, it taints it with egoism. If the husband claims that he loves his wife, but at the same time he hates her capacity to be a mother, and he demands that that capacity be poisoned in her, so that she will be available for him whenever he desires, but with the exclusion of parenthood and its responsibilities, he does not truly love her. In fact, he uses her and abuses her. And when the wife claims that she desires union with her husband, but at the same time she doesn't want him to be a father, doesn't want to hear about that possibility, she doesn't help him to grow in paternal generosity, and in fact she locks him in egoist irresponsibility. The contraceptive mentality isolates the unitive dimension from the procreative, attributing an exclusive significance to sexual experiences. Sexual encounters that are washed out of the procreative dimension become fundamentally egoist. They express already a distancing within the couple. Such isolated sexual experiences can never be fully satisfying. They therefore become something like an idol or a drug that demands increasing gratification. This leads to abuse, to egoist manipulations, to anger and aggression, first towards the potential child that from the start is hated, and then towards the spouse, when the increasing demand for gratification cannot be satisfied. This also leads to attempts to make the experiences more attractive through various perversions and to infidelity. Lack of responsibility towards the family, separation, divorce, single motherhood, the battering of babies, and abortion are a consequence of the egoist distortion of conjugal love. I do not know the figures in other countries, but in Italy, every 4 days a woman is murdered. Every 4 days. Only 1.9% of the murders are a result of conflicts between criminal gangs and mafias. When the mafias fight, it's the men who get killed. Sometimes a woman gets in the way, she gets shot, but the mafias don't kill women. 86.6% of the murderers are family members, husbands, partners, fiancés, or ex-husbands, ex-partners, ex-fiancés. Most of the victims of the remaining 11.5 murders are prostitutes. 84% of the murderers are ethnic Italians and not immigrants. Now, if so many women are murdered by their sexual partners, how many are beaten, abused, stalked, or just abandoned. This is a sign that there's something profoundly wrong in Italian sexual relationships. That is probably much worse in many other countries. The Church's perennial rejection of contraception is motivated not only by the defense of the moral order expressed in the natural law, but above all by concern for the quality of conjugal love, which is to express charity untainted by egoism. If supernatural love is to be lived out somewhere, it should first of all be lived out within the marital act. Openness towards the procreative dimension of the conjugal act and the avoidance of viewing the spouse uniquely as an object that is to satisfy the sexual urge preserves the quality of love. When that love is not wounded in its essence, it results in truly human relationships that are open towards the other person and towards the potential child, which as a twinkle is already accepted in its unique personhood. Not only direct contraceptive practices deform conjugal love, also the adapting to the cycle of fertility of the woman may involve a similar isolation of the unitive dimension of sexuality, although restraint exercised during the fertile period contributes to the growth of marital chastity when that restraint is motivated by charity. If natural family planning is practiced primarily as an expression of the contraceptive mentality, that mentality also distorts the quality of conjugal love. A conscious and willed exclusion of the procreative dimension cannot be an expression of supernatural love. Returning again to rational psychology, it can be said that the contraceptive mentality generates a false perception of sexuality as it is instinctively grasped by the practical reason and the vis cogitativa. When sex is immediately grasped by the mind, primarily and almost uniquely a source of pleasure, but not as a power of procreation, that is a safe sex, meaning safe from the enemy, that is the potential child. This erroneous perception of the practical reason hinders the genesis of the virtue of chastity. Virtues acquired and infused function automatically only if the instinctive cognition is true, in accord with the inherent finality of nature. Aquinas differentiated three ways of handling sexuality. The first approach is through the virtue of chastity, that domesticates the sexual desire with ease. This is because the virtue is located within the desire itself. The second approach is through continence, which is located not in the sensitive affectivity, but in the will. Thus it is not really a virtue, but it does serve as an emergency reaction defending against sin. In continence, the sexual desire is not integrated harmoniously in the person. It is only temporarily kept at bay. The third approach is neurotic and does not bring peace. In it there is an attempt to stamp out the sexual desire by another emotion. This never works and generates an obsessive and compulsive search for gratification, which is to release the tension. The mental maintaining of the intrinsic bond between the unitive and procreative significances of the conjugal act is also important for celibates. In their thinking and feeling and experiencing sexual desires, celibates are also tempted to fall into the contraceptive mentality. Since celibates are not planning a family of their own, in their imagination they are inclined to focus uniquely on the experiential dimension. This isolation of one dimension of sexuality with the exclusion of the other makes the integration of the sexual desire within chastity difficult. The addition of an appreciation of the value of procreation in moments of sexual feelings immediately calms the concupiscence, enables its psychic integration within chastity, and allows for a positive assessment of the sexual desire that can then be offered as a gift to God. The noting of the importance of what is grasped instinctively as the practical truth, and the fact that it can be profoundly distorted, helps explain the diversity of moral perceptions in differing cultures and in changing times. In some cultures, violence is automatically accepted as an appropriate means for the attainment of ends. It may be recognized that violence is painful, but when vast social programs are being accomplished, such as those proposed by the great ideologies of the 20th century, the use of violence was easily justified. Also today, when insignificant and spiritually unformed individuals who are lost in a nihilist, valueless world are suddenly given some ideal to fight for, and are given a Kalashnikov gun, they go for it. They know that maybe they will be killed, but nevertheless they think that it is worth it, because for a moment they feel important. When in a relativist, nihilist, consumerist world, serious questions do not meet with serious answers, then simple people accept any answer, so long as it gives them some, even perverse sense in life. Is not this how terrorism is born? Conclusion. I affirm that while we need to meet every individual where he is, with his wounds, limitations, and acquired deformations, at the same time we need to believe that there is no dimension of the human being that cannot be touched by the healing power of Christ's grace. The purification of the mind, both on its speculative and practical level, and of the heart, namely of the bodily input of practical cognition and affectivity, are what many are crying out for. It is a living faith that purifies hearts. As we note internal psychic resistances that are blocking the flowering of divine charity in souls, we need to invite the Holy Spirit. And we can do this in the words of an English Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. Lava quodes sordidum, riga quodes aridum, sana quodes saucium, flecte quodes rigidum, fove quodes frigidum, rege quodes devium, datuis fidelibus, inte confitentibus, sacrum septenarium. Da virtutis meritum, da salutis exitum, da perenne gaudium. Cleanse that which is unclean, water that which is dry, heal that which is wounded, bend that which is inflexible, fire that which is chilled, correct what goes astray, give to your faithful, those who trust in you, the sevenfold gifts. Grant the reward of virtue, grant the deliverance of salvation, grant eternal joy. Amen.